All right, class. Welcome back. Welcome, everybody. And it's been a while since we've last talked, but the reason for this visit is a very, very interesting reason. I'm very excited to talk about this. We are joined by Dr. Suzanne Onstine, who is an archaeologist working at the University of Memphis in the history department. And the reason I wanted her to come on and talk with us today is, as you can tell by my background, the release of the fifth and possibly final Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. And I thought it would be really fun to have somebody who is an expert in this area of archaeology to come on and talk about the accuracy and potential inaccuracies of the Indiana Jones movies and franchises. Um, and so, without further ado, Dr. Onstein, welcome to the class. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us. And if you could give us your background and your research into archaeology and your specialization.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I got my undergraduate degree in anthropology, archaeology, and then went on to graduate school to study ancient Egypt at the University of Toronto in the Near and Middle Eastern Studies Department, which a lot of Egyptologists get their degrees from those kind of programs that are multidisciplinary. So we study the ancient language, the art, as well as the archaeology, and um, people will specialize in whatever most interests them. And my interest was archaeology rather than philology or art history. So um, I ended up teaching in the history department because University of Memphis has Egyptology in the history department and art history department rather than in the earth sciences department where our archaeology department is located. So um, studying the past and ancient civilizations the way that Indiana Jones did is really a multidisciplinary activity. And so when I go dig, and I have an archaeological project now in Egypt in the area called the Valley of the Nobles, which is part of the big cemetery for regular people that is south in Luxor near the Valley of the Kings. And so my interests have always been in the non-royal people, and archaeology, for the most part, all over the world, is about non-royal people. Most of the archaeological remains anywhere from any time are about us, not the people in power. It's the houses of regular people and trying to reconstruct the lives of um, whoever we're studying, and using as many tools as we can in the process. So textual references or uh, things written in their own language from their time. These are places to start. And even Indiana Jones is using texts to guide where he's going to go look for something. And that's exactly what we do. So the dig that I do and have been doing for a few years is centered around a tomb that was built by a priest for him and his wife. And the ancient Egyptians called these tombs houses of eternity because they were, uh, designed for this long afterlife and for the benefit of the deceased to have that sort of place in the world where their spirits can come and go from. So basically, I've recorded the paintings on the walls and excavated the the burial shaft, which was actually reused by probably about 150 people later. So we have a huge number of human remains, mummies, broken up. Not they're not still complete, intact. Which most archaeology is also not complete. It's not intact. It's very disturbed. So one of the things that the Indiana Jones movies do is show you like best case scenario
Mhm.
where you find things intact and not in a million pieces. Um, this is what we wish for and seldom get.
Awesome. Thanks for that. The I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is I don't want to forget, I have a question about mummification and who is mummified. But starting earlier than that, you said when you were getting your graduate degree, you decided to focus more on archaeology than some other areas. What in particular made you decide your focus wanted to be archaeology?
Well, I grew up in Arizona and there's archaeology all around. And when I was 8 years old, the King Tut exhibit hit the United States in
Mm-hmm.
the 70s. And it was the first um, major exhibition focused on King Tut to leave Egypt. And I had a I had a teacher who wanted to focus a unit of class on ancient Egypt. And so we learned about hieroglyphs, we learned about the pyramids, I mean, third grade, how much specific can you be?
Yeah.
But since that time, I was really interested in how people lived in the past,
Okay.
how they were the same but different. It always struck me going to archaeological sites in Arizona that they're still building houses. They still have to solve problems like where does water come from?
Mm-hmm.
They still have specific foods that they can grow, but also become their traditional foods and reflect the sort of um, cultural norms. When I was 8, I wouldn't have articulated it like that, obviously, but the you know the interest in, I guess, how people lived in the past
Okay.
was just super interesting to me. And so when I got to my undergraduate years, I was able to specialize in archaeology through the anthropology department.
Okay.
So, and thankfully, there was a professor on campus who was also an Egyptologist, and
Oh, okay.
I found him and eventually ended up working in Egypt with him on his projects in Valley of the Kings. So that was pretty great.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. I mean, like going on, getting funding and going on these types of trips. Um, I can only imagine it would be a pretty amazing feeling. How many digs or archaeological trips have you been on?
Oh, a lot. Like
Okay.
I've been to Egypt more times than I can count now since 1990.
Okay.
That was my first trip, but that was as a student at American University for a semester abroad.
Okay.
And then 1994, I dug in Jordan. I was on a big project in Jordan doing an excavation on an Iron Age tell site. So one of the big mounds that are traditionally part of the Near Eastern
Hmm.
landscape. So um, then I started projects in Egypt in 95, and nearly every year since then,
Okay.
I've participated in some project or other, sometimes other people's, and then starting in 2008 when I started work at the University of Memphis, then I got to direct my own project. So
Okay. And I mean, what is it like directing a project of that size and scope? I mean, I imagine what we see in the movies, and I'm thinking of, in all the Indiana Jones movies, there's one or two times where you actually see a dig site. Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's a dig site. I'm thinking of that, and I'm also oddly thinking about one of the opening scenes in Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic Park,
mhm.
um, where there's many people. So what is it like to direct one of those projects? And kind of what goes into making sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing, I guess.
Right. Well, today archaeology can take a lot of different forms, and the project that I direct is actually pretty small because the tomb is pretty small. So I can't
Okay.
have more than like 4 or 5 people working
Okay.
down there. There's just not room. So, in our most active archaeological seasons, I had a couple of graduate students. I had a forensic anthropology team that consisted of physical anthropologist, a paleopathologist, and a radiologist to investigate the human remains parts. One of the most important parts of any excavation in Egypt or anywhere else is to have a local foreman who is
Okay.
responsible for hiring the best workers, taking care of logistical concerns like where do you buy screens, where do we get trowels from, all those equipment questions, because obviously a lot of archaeologists don't live where they dig.
Yeah.
And so, I know Egypt really well, but having a person who does this for a living for many different projects throughout the year, uh, my foreman is a guy named Omar Farouk, and he actually comes from a family known in Egyptology as the Guftawis, who are they can trace their family history with archaeology in Egypt back to the 1800s, the very beginning.
Wow.
A guy named Petrie was an English archaeologist, and he would come to Egypt and he would hire, like Indiana Jones, this cast of thousands to dig big sites. And so he trained up a whole bunch of local people to basically be in charge of the workforce.
Hmm.
And so, even if I don't have thousands or even hundreds of people, I still need a foreman like Omar to basically handle all the personnel issues and do what I tell him what I need, and he figures out with me how we can achieve that based on the money we have available, what kind of services and equipment are available, and he knows all the other archaeological teams as well as the government ministry that we work under the auspices of. So um, he's a really key person who works with me every year.
Okay.
Mhm.
Um, and earlier I said I wanted to ask a question about mummification. Um, the you research about the common people, not
Yeah.
the royalty. Um, in the culture, was it just royalty who went through the mummification process, or did everybody go through it in some way or another?
Um, a lot of people did it,
Okay.
and it wasn't reserved for royalty, but it did cost money. So the people who got mummified were those who had enough of
Hmm.
um, enough of an income and social status to be able to have a coffin prepared for themselves, to hire people to dig the tomb, because a lot of tombs are dug into a hillside or mountain. Some are built superstructures above ground, depending on the period and the place. So in Egypt, it's really about wealth. And
Hmm.
so there were a lot of wealthy people throughout Egypt's 3,000 years of pharaonic history. Um, but at any given time, it's still only a super, super small percentage of society. It's just that because they generate the material culture that we could find in excavations or these kinds of projects, we have sort of a distorted view of ancient Egypt
Yeah.
because a lot of our ideas about it are built on a very narrow segment of society. So, for example, if you were an archaeologist 1,000 years in the future and you're digging up Manhattan, and you're basing your view of America on Manhattan,
Hmm.
you're going to have a weird view of America, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So, and even within Manhattan, obviously, there's sections that are not wealthy, but uh, the kinds of things that might last the best are the things made out of very durable metals, which are expensive.
Hmm.
Um, Larger structures that would have required a lot of labor to build, like the pyramids or um, the Eiffel Tower. These kinds of big monuments are really visible and endure, but are they reflect the desires of a small group of people, but were made possible by everybody else.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
pyramids don't get built unless there's labor,
Yeah.
right? So I try to sort of balance when I'm teaching or talking about Egypt, to sort of balance out the kinds of biases that even academia is struggling with often, because we want to know more about people who didn't build pyramids and who had simple graves and so on. It's just much harder to identify them in the archaeological record.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's really great to focus on kind of the everyday person or the common person, because you know from my perspective, what I see in movies, I watched Moon Knight, and they uncovered Alexander the Great, and you watch like all of these, Indiana Jones, he's going after these priceless artifacts, and these very famous characters, or famous storylines, and that definitely makes sense. I understand why that's done, because that's done for entertainment purposes. More people can identify with those. But it's really neat to kind of get down, below that level.
Right.
What percentage, and I don't know if you know this, but what percentage would you say of archaeological research, or specifically archaeological digs, is focused on like the non-royalty versus the royalty? The royalty gets the big museums and all of that, but what percentage do you think focuses on like the common person?
Well, these days, a lot of people have, you know, a research design um, that has many different types of questions involved. And so, you know, a dig today looks very different than digs in the past. And one of the things that Indiana Jones gets right is that archaeology, from the 40s and earlier, was very much focused on getting that one museum piece
Mhm.
to take back for, the British Museum, the Louvre, wherever. And the shiny things, the really elite items were the kinds of things that um, they were interested in, and the other stuff got mentioned, but very summarily. It
Yeah.
was sort of.
Yeah.
Uh, I remember one excavation report I read from the late 1800s by a French archaeologist. Um, Basically said they were looking for uh, the mortuary temple of a queen, but there was all of this quote Coptic filth on top of it. The Coptic filth he was talking about was a Christian monastery dating to like 900 AD or something. So
Yeah.
still super ancient by everybody's standards, except Egyptologists who are diving back to
Yeah.
2000 1000 BC, And he was not interested in Christian relics. He was interested in the Pharaonic period. So a lot of stuff got chewed through in the early days of Egyptology and archaeology everywhere, because their focus was not on learning about regular people. It was about getting good stuff from museums and talking about kings and queens. And
Hmm.
one of the things that archaeology is really interesting for is that you can tell what kind of times people live in by what archaeologists are studying.
Yeah.
So, in the days of empire, what do archaeologists look at? Kings and queens, empire. In the 60s and the 70s, people were very focused on the environment. And this is where you get the evolution of new archaeology, which is very focused on environmental processes and how human beings inhabit landscapes and this kind of stuff. Um, More recently, gender and gender identities have become an area of focus, because as a society, we are very interested in that, starting with, uh, the women's lib movement and feminism, all the way up to queer identities
Hmm.
today. Different people will focus their archaeological analysis through those kind of lenses. So, we don't pick a site knowing that what we're going to find, but whatever's in our head guides how we're going to interpret the material that we find.
Yeah. Yeah. And so uh, another one more question on this, maybe two, and then we'll get into more Indiana Jones related material. But um, as much for me as it is for all other listeners or watchers, um, I I write about group behavior and why how the groups that we belong to influence the way we view other people and other groups and things like that. I do it in sport, outside of sport, entertainment. We've gotten into religion and politics and everything. But so my kind of end product whenever I do research is, writing a paper or writing a chapter or a book. Um, in your type of research, what kind of is the end product that you bring back or produce from a dig?
So, because archaeology is very destructive, I mean, basically, when you dig through a site, you completely destroy what it was.
Okay.
You've now intervened and become part of the archaeological record for people 1,000 years from now. So, a very, very important part of archaeology is documentation, good note taking, photographs, measurements, all this kind of stuff that Indiana Jones never did is basically
Yeah.
what happens on an archaeological site mostly. It's documenting, um, it could take the form of just a quick sketch of something, or it could be a full blown, like, studio photo session of objects that um, are you know destined for publication. But we write uh, interim reports about work. We write final reports when the whole excavation is complete. Um, we write specialty sorts of um, side or tangential things. So, for example, for the tomb that I'm working on, we've published papers about the human remains. And the tomb is where the stuff comes from, but really the value is in not only our interpretation, but making data available to other people so that
Hmm.
they can use it however they want. Sort of very open sourcing
Yeah.
our information. So that means even if I'm not looking at a specific aspect of my population, I will publish information about whatever it is
Yeah.
that other people might use or find useful. So, um, at the end of this project, it will be a book that has chapters on the art history, analysis of the scenes in the tomb, which will have implications for gender, religion, social structure, all different kinds of things. So that's one part. Analysis of the objects excavated, which will have the same kinds of analysis, art historical, translating texts, in addition to scientific analysis of human remains and, whatever else needs to be done. So publication is really the end goal, so that
Okay.
this site that I've now interfered with could be in some way reconstructed. The hope
Okay.
is that, nowadays people are using a lot of photogrammetry, 3D modeling, and stuff like that. So books aren't the ending of publication, they're part of a publication sort of strategy a lot. And projects will have websites or Instagram pages or other social media where they make these more um, visual uh, sorts of products available to anybody.
Yeah. And it's very interesting. You said when you are on a dig, you become part of the archaeological record for
Yeah.
people in the future. That's such an interesting, just kind of thing to note for my perspective. Um, and I also want to mention to anybody, students or non-students who are watching or listening to this, the University of Memphis has a very strong um, archaeological presence and presence in Egyptian history and mythology and everything, based on based on the link, or the, I guess, the history of the city of Memphis. And so working at a university like the University of Memphis, was the link between the city and ancient Egypt, what was that a major factor in you choosing to be at the university?
No, no.
Okay.
Academics don't often get to choose where they work. There's an open job somewhere and you go
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Egyptology is a very rarefied sort of career. So there are very few schools in the United States who let you teach Egyptology as a discipline. So I have graduate students, and even though people come out with a history degree and study other aspects of history other than ancient Egypt, we are training up a future generation of Egyptologists who are multidisciplinary and who will, be the next sort of part of that next generation of writers of history and so on. So the city itself has, Egyptianizing things uh, in various places and in various ways, but the establishment of Egyptology at the University of Memphis wasn't until, I believe, the 80s,
Okay.
or maybe there was a Ramses exhibit that
Hmm.
came here long before I came to Memphis. And as a result of that, some people donated some objects, ancient
Hmm.
Egyptian objects, to the museum, the art museum on campus. And then the university decided, oh, we need someone who knows about these things
Yeah.
to deal with it. And uh, the people in the art history department were instrumental in sort of founding what is called the Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology. And it's a center of excellence. It's not a program that you study in. It's a center of excellence that's associated with history and art history. So it's there are many different sort of ways of thinking about Memphis's history with ancient Egypt.
Yeah. And the museum on campus is really, really cool to walk through. It's a really, really fun, really, really informative museum if anybody ever has a chance to go over and do that. Just consequently, that you mentioned the Ramses exhibit. Do you know, is that where, I mean, the large Ramses II statue on campus. I know came from in front of the pyramid, which is where basketball used to be played. Now is a Bass Pro Shop, a very neat Bass Pro Shop inside. But do you know, did that statue, that replica of the statue, did that come from that original exhibit in the 80s? Okay.
Yeah, that was
Okay.
part of that exhibit, which was held in the pyramid. So that's why
Yeah.
it was at the pyramid. And the actual statue is in Memphis, Egypt, the
Yeah.
ancient capital, Mennefer, which the Greeks heard Mennefer and thought Memphis.
Okay.
Anyway, so the statue is actually one that's even older. The real statue was one that Ramses II usurped from a Middle Kingdom king. So basically, saw a statue and he's like, my name would look really good on that. So he just recarved his name on it.
Okay.
And what we have then is an exact replica in, I think it's fiberglass or, I'm not sure what the material is, but he's hollow.
Yeah.
We always joke that we would love to hide a little motion activated speaker in there to terrify people as they walk by it.
Well, I walk by that almost every day that I go to campus. So
Yeah.
I think I would probably, if that ever happened, I would fall for that every time because I'm walking by that almost every day that I go. Finally, I for people who haven't listened, Dr. Josh Roberson, when he joined, that was class 90 in the episode list. We talked about the history of the city and the ties to ancient Egypt. But I wanted to give you an opportunity before we switch topics. Is there one or two lessons or maybe a trivia points or tidbits about the city of Memphis's ties to Egypt that you like to share, that you like commonly share with people?
Well, I mean, the presence of the river, I
Mm-hmm.
think, is really an important aspect to sort of highlight because the Mississippi River um, and the Nile are both really fundamental aspects of the landscape. So not just for Memphis, but for the country. So for America, if you look at the whole watershed system of the Mississippi, a huge percentage of all waterways end up through various
Mm-hmm.
channels emptying into the Mississippi. And so a lot of our water resources in this country are tied up in what essentially is a Mississippi system. In Egypt, there's only one river, the Nile. And without the Nile, Egypt doesn't exist. It's a desert. And people can't really live there. But because they have this agricultural ability, they have drinking water, they're able to form this amazing civilization on the banks of the river. And that agricultural capacity of river valley settlements is exactly the same as Memphis. Memphis began as an agricultural hub.
Mm-hmm.
The trading of cotton and other agricultural products is sort of the foundation of society. In America in general, the foundations of our society were agricultural, and every ancient society has that sort of thing in common with us.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I find the kind of the significance of the Mississippi River very, very interesting for the city and the city's link to ancient Egypt as well. So talking about Indiana Jones, I think the first thing to start with is, in your view, what has been the impact of Indiana Jones on archaeology and on interest in the fields that are related to archaeology?
Well, I mean, it's a common question, and it's a question I think that people ask in a lot of different ways, which is basically how does the media affect the public?
Yeah.
And Indiana Jones, oh, hi Kitty.
Hello.
Indiana Jones, like all the mummy movies previously, really capture people's attention because it's an exotic location that most people will never visit. It's about discovery, and human beings are discoverers by nature. Our curiosity has led us to do some crazy things, from dying in a submersible explosion looking for Titanic remains to the moon. Like all of the spectrum of discovery in between. It could be very, very exciting in Indiana Jones style, or it could be poring over a book and realizing that that place name that you couldn't figure out is actually a real thing and you know
Mhm.
where it is. So the um, I don't know, I guess the movie itself has a net positive impact in my opinion, just because uh, in this day and age everybody knows what archaeology is and has
Mhm.
formed some opinion of it, good or bad. And Indiana Jones can reinforce good and bad stereotypes. So, on the bad side, it reinforces this idea of archaeologists as colonial looters. But on the good side, it also focuses on the ethical stance of Indiana Jones that it belongs in a museum for, potentially everybody to enjoy, even if that's um, historically been a problematic thing because whose museums,
Yeah.
right? He's taking
Yeah.
it back to museums where the ants or the descendants of those ancient Egyptians will never see it.
Yeah.
They're never going to American museums or British museums, in the 40s. So the there's an ethical stance that he's taking that is appropriate for the time period that he lived because he reflects some of the more negative aspects of how archaeology used to be done, but it also reflects that transition where, yes, they're sort of treasure hunting, but there's also a notion that that treasure hunting is for the purposes of discovery and elucidating a period of history for everyone, for
Mhm.
anyone to consume this history.
Yeah. I it's one of those things that it gains interest, but what does it say about, or kind of what impression does it give to people about what actually happens? So, where are some accuracies of the Indiana Jones films? There are extended storylines and books and everything, but specific to the films that most people have seen. What are some of the things that they actually get right about what a working archaeologist would do?
Well, the beginning of the movies always set up the rest of the adventure through discovering something in a text, discovering something about an object, something that inspires bigger questions to go look for. So, as archaeologists, we don't just pick a plot of land and just start digging. We're guided to a specific area based on either someone coming to us and saying, there's a whole lot of pottery on the surface
Mhm.
of the ground over here. There's probably archaeological material under the ground as well. Or we're reading through texts and we get a description of a place that we know should be in this area and we go look for it. So there's the kind of processes that he goes through in a very, abbreviated way is coming up with a place to dig, based on research that is accurate in the sense of process. How he goes about the process, pretty quick and dirty, and there's always the urgency because Nazis, and um, I don't often have that problem. So I have a leisurely uh time frame for
Yeah.
excavating because Nazis aren't coming for the stuff in my tomb.
Yeah.
So
And so on that note, you know, what we see in a 3-minute scene in a movie where he either discovers something in a text or he discovers an item or something. Um, the specific to the discovery of a text to set up the rest of the adventure in real time, how long is that? I mean, is that years process that you just like kind of build up to this point where then you think, hey, there's more to be seen? Or kind of, what's the real approach to that?
it varies. I mean, one of the great things about archaeology is there's no one way to do things. You're really guided by the nature of your evidence. So if you have very fragmentary texts that leave out some important parts, you may spend a lot of time trying different things to figure that missing part out.
Hmm.
Um, not not specifically maybe the text, although we have a lot of new technology now that a text that was previously unreadable because it had been eroded or sort of washed off the surface of something, traces of writing might still remain and be visible through various kinds of hyperspectral imaging or RTI. There's all kinds of technologies that people are using now to reconstruct texts that aren't visible with the naked eye
Hmm.
or even just by enlarging with the camera. So once we have sort of enough information, then you have to go through the all of the steps to secure permission to dig in a
Hmm.
place. And every country is different. Uh, for the uh, for the Egyptian government, there's a ministry that is specifically uh, dedicated to archaeology and antiquities, and so you have to make an application to them. And there are there's a lot of steps involved in that. So you can't just, write to an official and say, I want to dig somewhere.
Hmm.
You have to be an actual trained professional like me. You have to have an institutional affiliation, so a university, a museum. You have to fund it yourself. You have to take a lot of time in the application to show the government that your research design has value,
Hmm.
that you're not just a pot hunter, a looter, and you're going to, chew up a site. Egypt doesn't let any antiquities leave the country. So everything that I've ever dug up stays in Egypt. Not every country is like that. So, it could vary a lot, the process.
Okay. Um, so then what else about I'll say Professor Henry Jones, what else about him that we see in the movies is is accurate for a working archaeologist? I mean, does it stop at the fact that he is a professor and we see him in scenes where he's teaching class? Does it stop there, or are there other things that like real archaeologists actually engage in before an adventure begins, so to speak?
Well, I mean, it is very accurate that the scenes in the first movie open up with him teaching. You know, most Egyptologists are either museum professionals or professors, and um, that's worldwide. Archaeology is largely cultural resource management. When anybody builds a freeway, there's an archaeological
Mhm.
assessment. Are there any sites here? If there are, they have to be dug in accordance with local laws and federal statutes about American Indians and their
Mhm.
rights to their past. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that um, American archaeologists do that people digging in other places maybe don't. Um, so there's that aspect of it, that we are teachers, but many people just work professionally as diggers,
Mhm.
doing archaeology as in a in a contract setting. So a firm will get a contract to do the excavations in this place while land development is happening, and then they move on to a contract in another part of town. And so most archaeologists here in Memphis are actually doing that kind of work, which is really important. Um, but for Egyptology and these sort of traditional old school disciplines, classics, people who do classical archaeology in Rome, Greece, they're largely going to be professors and museum people.
Okay.
In terms of other things that he's doing right, he has local contacts who facilitate his work. That's very accurate. Um, he has to contend with people who are using the past for political gains or for political
Mhm.
reasons. So the Nazis were well known for their interest in prehistory. And so one of the intellectual struggles in the first movie is, Indiana Jones is saving history for the right people and not letting the Nazis subvert it for their own uses. And of course, all the supernatural stuff is not something that I ever encounter. But archaeologists are just people. There may be archaeologists out there who believe in supernatural things or who believe in um, any aspect of the ancient world will have religious beliefs and those kinds of things attached to it. So, you know, most archaeologists are not obviously believing that the ark has superpowers or
Yeah.
that an object that we find could take us back in time or any of that stuff. But we are interested in the ancient people who did believe those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's also pretty accurate.
And I've also read that in most, or if not all, the movies, there actually is, it starts, most of the time it starts from a place of fact, or I guess I should say believed theory or accepted theory. Like in Temple of Doom, I recently learned that the cult he kind of battles with, the Thuggy cult, was a real cult. The item, I can't pronounce it, in Dial of Destiny, there actually was
Yep.
there, that is historically accurate. There, I think a lot of people know the stories of the Ark of the Covenant, the Crusades, the Charlotte thing, like that. Um, does Most of the time, do they actually start with something that is factual, and then where does kind of the imagination process and the grander than life scale entertainment process take over in the movies?
Well, the belief in supernatural powers attached to these objects is obviously a sort of um, major plot device
Hmm.
that fuels interest to the point where you're willing to murder a lot of people, or interest that you need to rescue this object from people who will use its power,
Yeah.
right? So, nothing that I've ever discovered has supernatural power, so no one's willing to kill me for it. um, but in archaeology, especially uh, in areas where there's a lot of political turmoil, the looting of antiquities is directly linked to terrorism. You
Okay.
know, the uh, ISIS or Daesh, however you want to refer to them, over in Syria and in the Middle East. One of the things that they did was loot archaeological sites to fund their activities,
Okay.
and they destroyed many as well in order to sort of erase history. You know, one of the things that's in the Indiana Jones movie is really this idea of who controls the objects controls writing history, kind of, right? So the Nazis want the Ark of the Covenant for
Hmm.
power, but also in a real sense, the Nazis were very interested in prehistory because they wanted to write it in a way that confirmed their ideology. Um, the Antikythera object that was discovered in the
Okay.
shipwreck, which is the Dial of Destiny object. You know, whoever controls that controls history, literally, because they're going back in time to do things different, to actually control history. And archaeology controls history in the sense of we are the ones who interpret the
Hmm.
archaeological record that is the basis for a lot of history. So, and if we were to sort of make a comparison to an historical archaeology project, Heinrich Schliemann was a very, I don't know, a little bit like Indiana Jones in that he was looking for things that he knew about from classical texts. So he was looking for ancient Troy. He was
Okay.
looking for evidence of Greek myths. And he churned through sites with a cast of thousands of workers looking for Troy because he took the text in the Iliad at face value and looked through every description of the landscape, located a site in Turkey that fit all of those descriptions, had obvious massive fortification walls, and in fact, he probably found the ancient city of Troy. Now, you know, will he find evidence of the gods interfering in the fights between Achilles and the Trojans? No. And in fact, he actually plowed right through the levels that were probably contemporary with the time period that the Iliad describes.
Okay.
So, um, he's motivated by a real object, a real thing, the Iliad, the story. Funds a huge expedition to locate this very famous city, and does a lot of damage to it.
Yeah. Um, you earlier you mentioned the ethics and the ethical considerations or discussions around the movies, being something that has a maybe a net positive. And it made me think of something that um, I I shared with Dr. Onstine before we started recording that I recently listened to an audiobook of Indiana Jones and philosophy. And one of the chapters in there, a person was talking about um, how Indiana Jones would always want to take something back to a museum so people could see it. You made a really interesting point about, the people who are hiring people to go and find artifacts and bring back to their museums. They are not the people that the ancestors of those people that lived there in that time. They don't represent those ancestors, and those ancestors may never be able to see that. So in the chapter, the author made a comment about in Temple of Doom, Indiana Jones deciding not to take the artifact back to a museum, and actually made the comment, something paraphrasing, something like it'll just rot in a museum, or it'll just sit and
Yep.
collect
It's
dust in
just
the
another
museum or
rock.
whatever. Yeah. And instead he leaves it with the tribe that needs it in the Temple of Doom. And also that reminds me, because I mentioned the Thuggee cult, I do want to say that when I read about that. Um, the 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 Thuggee cult was a real cult that would kind of befriend people, travel with people, and then try to rob and loot them. The supernatural aspect about, in the temple trying to pull someone's beating heart, that was Steven Spielberg and others who came up with that idea, I guess.
Yeah.
That was not an accurate to the cult. But um back to what I was saying about him leaving the stone with the tribe. um Based on your comment earlier, was that actually the most ethical decision he could make? Because that was something that in this heightened reality would benefit this tribe. So he left it with the tribe. Now he lost two other stones that could have helped them as well, but
Yeah.
they burned through the bag. Um, was that the more was that the more ethical decision to leave them with the tribe than to try to take them to a museum where people may not have been able to see them from the tribe?
Absolutely, because this is not a dead culture.
Yeah.
Like, the people were actively worshiping in a system that this object was part of, not
Okay.
just their heritage, not just, thousands of years ago, our ancestors, believed this, and that's just the past. It was an active belief system. And so that is absolutely the right thing to do, is to leave it with the people who still consider it a sacred object. That's their cultural patrimony. That's their heritage, or their rights to their own objects of belief. And in the past, archaeologists haven't really paid much attention to that, because especially in the earlier days of archaeology, and um, the colonial structures allowed Europeans to go everywhere in the world.
Mhm.
India, China, Africa, everywhere. And what did they want? They wanted exotic, pretty things to make their neighbors jealous.
Mhm.
Did they respect those cultures? No. They had a very Christian worldview that anybody who didn't believe in Christianity was a heathen, and their objects don't hold any sacred value whatsoever. And so it was nothing to them to take it from the people who venerated it still, or were invested in preserving it, regardless of current beliefs versus past beliefs. So that whole period allowed for massive amounts of cultural heritage to leave their country of origin. I read something just recently. A museum here in America had a statue. I think it was a Hindu statue. This statue was actually a goddess for the people of, was it Nepal? I think it was Nepal. They knew exactly when it left their town. They
Yeah.
knew that it was looted. And, but they're a marginalized small population from a remote part of the world. What are they going to do?
Yeah.
Who do they appeal to that cares? It wasn't until recently that someone who had a specialty in this, iconography, and was like, that looks like the statue that should be over there.
Yeah.
They did some investigations, and eventually they had to return it because it was looted. It was an object of active worship and veneration.
Mm.
It was just taken away from
Yeah.
people. So Indiana Jones, in that moment of leaving it with them, even though his motives were questionable in looking for it to take it, and only then afterwards realizing that, oh, maybe it should stay here.
Yeah.
um it was a learning moment for Indiana Jones.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so to get into the topic of inaccuracies,
Yeah.
um, to start off, we'll name some inaccuracies, but also maybe to start, could you give an approximate, like, could you give a percentage of what you think the movies are accurate, how accurate they are? I mean, is it
Well,
10%? Is it less or more? I don't know.
it would be hard to quantify because the movie's premises are supernatural.
Hmm.
Usually, you got aliens in the Crystal Skull, which we should never speak of again because that was a terrible movie. So if you believe in aliens, this is all accurate. If you believe those crystal skulls are real, an ancient artifact that was made by an alien, then this is a documentary for you. But
Hmm.
for most people, obviously this is just fantasy. Um, I guess the accuracies come in portraying archaeology from a previous era, which was very much
Okay.
focused on objects and was
Okay.
insensitive to
Sorry.
local cultural beliefs and so on.
Hmm.
Um, but there are also a lot of inaccuracies that are sort of, it's clear that they didn't hire a researcher who was very knowledgeable about the specific area that they were portraying. So, in the first movie where they're digging in Egypt, plot conveniences require that they create, a map room. There's
Hmm.
there's no Egyptian map room. There's nothing like that. Um, so that's inaccurate. There's for the other movies, different cultures that I'm not a specialist in, I can't even imagine how many inaccuracies there are. In the most recent one, when they're talking about the languages that they're reading on the device, he says linear B and something else as a cipher. Linear B is ancient Greek. Linear B is a script used to write ancient Greek. It's not a code. It's not um, it's a language. So if they had had someone who was a specialist in
Hmm.
classics advising them, he wouldn't have called it a code, you know.
Yeah.
Um, he was looking at a pot and described it as Syrian and the kind of decoration. I question whether or not that was accurate, but I'm not a specialist in Syrian pottery. I only have, sort of vague notion that that doesn't seem right. But I know who I would ask if I really wanted to know that.
Yeah.
But those are like minutia. The bigger things that drive the plot are all of these sort of fantastical and supernatural
Yeah.
things. Yeah. So a lot of inaccuracies on that side of things, some accuracies in terms of portraying cultural views at the time. Um, Quantifying that would be kind of impossible, I think.
Okay. Um, and one thing that I was wondering from your response, you you mentioned we should never talk about the kingdom of the Crystal Skull again.
So we're gonna.
Is that yeah, yeah. Is that in your opinion because of the just kind of the storyline, the entertainment value, or is it kind of the notion of what this fantastical journey was, kind of the underpinning of the story? Because whenever I've watched the movies, and I've enjoyed all of them, I enjoyed the Crystal Skull. I watched it again on Disney Plus the other day and kind of refreshed my memory of it. But I think two of the movies have the reason I asked this question is two of the movies I believe have either an appeal or subject matter that a lot of people are at least aware of on the surface. Raiders of the Lost Ark, dealing with the Ark of the Covenant, The Last Crusade. They do you so I guess first, do you think what's the reason you don't like Kingdom of the Crystal Skull? And then the second would be, do you think the kind of the underlying subject matter has how important is that to like kind of the entertaining value or consumption of those projects? If that was a long question, I'm not sure it makes much sense. So
So, well, the first thing is that all of the Indiana Jones movies are seeking an object that in the real world, in our real world, are the subject of conspiracy theories.
yeah, yeah,
And people love conspiracy
yeah.
theories and love, um, even if you don't believe that the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail have
Hmm.
actual powers, the all of the conspiracy theories about who has them, what happened to them, all of those kinds of things are, immensely interesting to folks these days. And the crystal skulls, those are an object that, um, are the source of a lot of conspiracy theory thinking as well. And so for me personally, the the aliens conspiracy theories are the most annoying to deal with as an Egyptologist, because these kind of theories are they're really rooted in a racist belief that ancient Egyptians could not have done great things,
Yeah,
even though, through their writings and through what they left us, there's a huge amount of evidence to suggest that they were perfectly capable of figuring out geometry and engineering problem
yeah,
solving these kinds of issues, over and over again. Not just that the aliens plunked down a pyramid
yeah,
somewhere, but that the Egyptians over 3,000 years applied this same sort of, excuse me, engineering knowledge to solving all kinds of problems, not just building a pyramid. So the ancient aliens business is, for Egyptologists, one of the most annoying things to
okay,
contend with. Is, I mean, even people who don't believe in it, one of the first things that they ask me when they find out I'm an Egyptologist is, oh, so, aliens built the pyramids, right? Just joking,
yeah,
but that's the first thing that anybody says about ancient
yeah.
Egypt. Oh, aliens. Like, ugh, it has hijacked. It has hijacked entire conversations about a field that is, so intrinsically interesting in it, in what's actually truthful or factual, or however you want to put it, that these crazy interpretations obscure a really beautiful culture.
Yeah,
So the crystal skulls brought in that ancient aliens aspect of it that is super, super annoying to me and most of my colleagues as
yeah,
well.
yeah. Well, and earlier when we were talking before we started talking about Indiana Jones, I almost asked you about, what are some of the amazing technological feats um of ancient Egyptians. And so it definitely that that definitely makes sense that that would be annoying to someone in your field who me watching it just from an entertainment perspective and thinking like, this is so fantastical that there's no way this is real. But looking back at every film that's been made, is any of it real? No. Or, again, conspiracy theories around it. Um, that it,
Well, I mean,
I see it different than somebody who is an expert in the area sees it for sure. Go ahead. Sorry.
so I am a huge consumer of science fiction.
Okay.
I love science fiction. That's the genre I read before I go to sleep. That's the movies I love the most. So I'm not anti-aliens. I am anti-aliens hijacking ancient
Yeah.
cultures.
Yeah.
And um it's it's not even my culture, and it's insulting to
Yeah.
humanity in general. But the Egyptians are also uh, not excited about people ascribing their accomplishments to aliens.
Yeah.
That's it's very insulting to them
Yeah.
as well. So, the kinds of entertainment value that you're talking about and when we consume is firmly in the realm of conspiracy theories that people
Yeah.
believe. And one of the reasons why these movies and others like the Dan Brown Da Vinci Code, why those kinds of movies really catch people's attentions, because that conspiracy aspect is where you get drama and adventure in terms of figuring something out that nobody else has ever figured out before. Because ultimately, people who believe in conspiracies, they're drawn to it because it makes them feel like they've solved something that even the experts didn't solve.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
it makes them, sort of independently intelligent without having to do the work of learning about an ancient
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah.
you know.
Well, and one thing that it one of your earlier responses in this just now made me think of is one thing with conspiracy theories is depending on who believes what,
Mhm.
they can either find proof or in their beliefs or lack of proof in someone else's beliefs, regardless of reality, regardless of what happens. Two people can look at the same conspiracy and see different things, and they're kind of allowed to both believe their own path or believe that they are correct. Do you think, this is a little off topic, I guess, but kind of going back to that second question I asked, do you think the use of conspiracy theories in entertainment, um uh, do you think that's why conspiracy theories are used in entertainment? Because people, when they watch these movies, can walk away thinking that based on what you believe, you are correct or the other belief is wrong. Do you think that's a kind of an important part of all of these projects?
Well, I mean, people who are very invested in conspiracy theories definitely get a lot of fuel and support from media, not just Indiana Jones style things, but TV shows like Ancient Aliens that
Hmm.
are presented in documentary style, that are presenting things not as fiction or presenting things as this is what, a couple of people believe, but they often veer into really blurring the line between what your analytical lens is or what your preconceptions are about a thing and what the thing actually is,
Hmm.
right? So this is where, critical thinking is especially important because you can have an object in front of you and every person will have a different interpretation. If your interpretation is based on supernatural things, it's based on ideologies that promote, racial ideas or, those kinds of things, your interpretation is going to veer into some crazy territory
Yeah.
often.
Okay.
Um, and so, this is part again of the Nazis showing up in these movies because they were very concerned with uh, interpreting the past through their cultural lens and erasing other versions, controlling the media of interpretation, the actual objects.
Hmm.
So, the sum total of cable TV and YouTube and everything that allows anybody to talk about anything has a harmful effect because people aren't responsible. If I'm just putting a TikTok out there. I can say whatever I want.
Mm,
There's no consequences for me lying about anything or making something up or, taking someone's assumptions and then blowing them out of proportion in a different
yeah.
way or, so there's a harmful effect there. But just for the Indiana Jones movies themselves, because it exists in this larger context, their impact specifically is probably pretty small. It's
Okay.
just another
Yeah.
piece of a larger media puzzle that is troubling. I mean, when I was a kid, there was a show called In Search of, and Leonard
Hmm.
Nimoy, Spock, was the host, the narrator of it. And it presented the same kinds of stuff that Ancient Aliens deals with, but in a much more investigative journalist kind of
Hmm.
way. Like, some people believe this. What if, the imagery that the Dogon people are putting on their pots and their walls is actually representing stars? What if? Not, it absolutely does,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And the Ancient Aliens people, they find people to say whatever fuels those kinds of conspiracies or fuels those
Yeah.
kinds of beliefs. And most viewers aren't really that critical of talking heads,
Yeah.
especially if it confirms something they already believe.
Yeah. Um, that that sort of ties in with another question I have before we get to the question of um how good an archaeologist as Indiana Jones and then the activity. The last question I have on this, I think, is you had mentioned the when we were talking about the inaccuracies of the films, um, it made me question what what responsibility do you think movies and companies and studios that are making these movies or producing these movies, what responsibility do you think they have, excuse me, to be as accurate as possible when they are making something for entertainment?
Well, I mean, responsibility is a slippery word. I mean, do media companies have a responsibility to anything? No, they have a responsibility to make money for their shareholders. That's it. That's
Okay.
that's their, legal responsibility, I guess, for their existence. But in a cultural way, a more ethical way of doing things would be to get a lot more expert input into how they portray things. So, for example, the movie Troy from several years ago, if they had just hired one classics graduate student to talk about the set dressing, it would have been a much better movie. you know, I mean, Egyptologists, classical archaeologists, historians, all of us who interpret the past have a specific skill set that could be used by
Hmm.
media and often is, but to a very small degree. So, since this is a a Disney oriented class, I can give you an example from a sort of animated world that the Prince of Egypt about Moses, right? It has a talking camel in it. It's clearly, a kids movie and everything. They hired an Egyptologist to consult on the movie. That Egyptologist was a professor that I was taking classes with at the
Okay.
time. And so he related when he came back his experience with this, which was they only wanted me to look at the drawings of the hieroglyphs to make sure that it didn't accidentally say bad words.
Yeah. Yeah.
They didn't want to consult about historical details. They didn't want to consult about, how it looked in terms of like what would common people wear versus pharaohs or, all that kind of stuff. No, they just wanted to cover their butts and make sure it didn't accidentally, you know, insult somebody's mother in really rude
Yeah.
ways in the hieroglyphs behind the animated people.
Okay.
He was very frustrated by this.
Yeah.
On the other hand, though, Stargate hired an Egyptologist to do their dialogue. All of that ancient dialogue of the people on the planet, um, they're speaking basically a form of Coptic, which is the ancient Egyptian language in the Christian period, the very early Christian period, so a few hundred years AD. So that is a language that's still used today in Coptic churches, which is the Orthodox Christianity of Egypt. And so they hired an Egyptologist who was familiar with Coptic to construct an ancient Egyptian dialect that these people could speak.
Hmm.
And so when I went to the movie as a graduate student with other Egyptology graduate students, we're like, holy crap, we understand them.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
it was very funny. So movie theaters can do a lot to improve accuracies, but they already know that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so on to the big question. Um, is Henry Jones Jr., the character, is he a good or serviceable archaeologist, or um I guess how good of an archaeologist is the character?
For his time, he was still terrible, probably. But I only say that because the movie only gives us a sliver of his career. We
Yeah.
don't know, is he writing up things when he gets back? Is he transcribing notes that he took in the field into making it into an article? Is he doing any of the other things that archaeologists do? Because mostly our jobs are thinking about things and then writing about them
Yeah.
and less digging them up. So from the movies, we don't know what he's doing on that account. So I have no idea how to qualify him as good or bad in that way. Even for the 40s, people were taking photographs of archaeological sites before they destroyed them.
Yeah.
Um, he doesn't have any research design. He doesn't have um, any plan. And even by the 40s, archaeologists had a more a more well-rounded research design, which guided where they were going to dig, what kinds of questions they were hoping to answer, um, what are the big questions that digging here will help me talk about. So, even Heinrich Schliemann, when he was looking for Troy and the Iliad, he was looking for, his big question was the Iliad real? Was this classical story that has survived, a couple of thousand years and was a sort of cornerstone of literary uh, development for the ancient Greeks? Is this a real place? Were these real events? Minus
Hmm.
the gods interfering in things and making supernatural things happen. So he had a research design. Finding Troy will help us talk about classical antiquity in this specific way. Indiana Jones in all of these movies is reactive and
Hmm.
not proactive. He's reacting to a crisis, which, in a sense, people who are doing cultural resource management here or in any other place, a lot of it is salvage archaeology. They're just steps in front of a bulldozer before that shopping mall gets built.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've worked on plenty of CRM projects, archaeological projects that were literally dig up this site because there's a shopping mall going in.
Okay.
Um, so in that sense, if we think of him as a salvage archaeologist, I'm going to get this stuff before the Nazis get it.
Yeah.
Um, you know, that's a little accurate, but the whole structure of how it happens is chaotic and crazy and not at all how things would actually happen.
Yeah. Um, so then we will have a little exercise where I want to go
Okay.
through two, maybe three examples, some of the bigger examples from the movies,
Mhm.
and you tell me what should have happened. And so the first one is the scene behind me, the famous boulder scene, the very first time we see Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, before it was actually referred to as Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Um, he enters for the golden idol. He makes his way past a series of traps to get to the idol. And we know what happens next. He tries to take the idol, put down a bag of sand that he thinks is the approximate weight of the idol, and everything goes horribly wrong. He gets chased out by a boulder, and then ultimately gets the idol taken by Belloc and people that are working with him. What would a real archaeologist have done in that instance? My guess is probably not have entered it at all, not entered the cave at all until proper inspection. But what would a real archaeologist have done?
Well, in the process of discovery, you don't know that there's a thing until you go into the thing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So for Indiana Jones, absolutely he would have walked into a
Okay.
cave to see what's there, right? But the circumstances of how he does that are going to be under much more controlled circumstances. Like for the for the time, even then, a lot of governments would have required some kind of supervision
Mm-hmm.
to do any work in the country. So some kind of government inspector or government representative probably would have been with him. Um, Absolutely, he would have taken photographs. He would have made notes about it to sort of lay the groundwork for how to interpret the whole site instead of just the idol. So there would have been a lot more attention to documenting things up to leading into the cave. There was all those markers that he was
Mm-hmm.
following in the jungle, the statues or whatever that um, pointed him in the right direction. So those would have been, from an archaeologist's point of view, so we could have spent like a week on each of those markers,
Yeah, yeah.
documenting it, translating what's on it, cleaning it so that it was, visible on all sides, and measuring it. And, you know, archaeology takes its time, whatever the object or whatever the site requires.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't have gotten to the entrance to the cave for weeks
Yeah.
based on that, right? um, but he absolutely would have walked into that cave understanding that he was looking for something inside, and probably something specific based on
Okay.
texts and all this other kind of stuff. But he would have been photographing things. Even in the 40s, he would have had some guy hauling along the tripod, and taking pictures every 10 meters or something, in order to capture what it looks like before anybody's touched it, in a
Okay.
sense. So then, approaching the golden idol, traps are way overrepresented. Like in archaeological sites, there's no quicksand, there's no arrows shooting past my head, there's no, floors dropping out underneath me necessarily. There's way fewer traps than you might
Yeah.
think. So, um, as an archaeologist, I would have wandered into the cave and been mostly concerned with, you know, not stepping on uneven ground and twisting my ankle, or are there giant spiders I need to be concerned with, and bats. There's always bats.
Okay.
So, I would have been sort of minding the ceilings to see how much it moves
Yeah.
uh
Yeah.
from the bats. And you can smell also who's been living in a cave. Is it bat guano? Is it carnivore poo? Um,
Yeah.
so you would have been using all of your senses to sort of suss out what's going on
Okay.
inside. And so when he gets to the idol finally, um, because of the mechanisms that he understood to be there, he knew that he had to replace the statue with a bag. And ultimately he was wrong, because it still triggered the boulder to chase him. Um, so, you know, all of us would have run.
Yeah.
Take the idol and run. There's a boulder chasing me. I need to get out. But also for archaeologists, somebody knows where we are all the time. I mean, these days, I can make cell phone calls from the tomb that I work in, not
Okay.
deep underground, but at the entrance where there's still
Yeah.
signal. Um, in the 40s, obviously that was not the case, but he would have probably had, if he knew he was going into a cave, he would have had a geologist who would have assessed the structural integrity of the room. Is it safe to spend any time in, or is the ceiling going to cave in
Yeah.
randomly, or more likely not fully cave in, but we're going to get hit with falling rocks. And if it's a deep cave, gases.
Yeah.
Is this an area of tectonic activity that's going to produce, the gases that kill people?
Yeah.
So there would have been more people on his team to make an architectural plan, assess the geology, the photography. There would have been more people with him.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
One question, would a real archaeologist even try to remove the little I can't think of the word now. Would he have tried to remove the device? Or would that have been studied and made sure that was safe, and made sure like what kind of accuracy that was, or what kind of historical context that's placed in before it's even moved?
Triggering everything
Yeah.
to kill you. Yeah, I think most archaeologists would have studied the mechanisms, but part of studying the mechanism is triggering it. So
Yeah.
100% in a safe way, somebody would have tried to trigger it to see how it
Okay.
worked.
Okay.
And in doing so, perhaps destroy it. But again, archaeology is inherently a destructive act,
Okay.
because we're digging through a context left behind by somebody else, or we're not trying to destroy the objects or the human remains, or any of that stuff, but just the dirt that all of that exists in is a context that we take away in order to expose the cultural features that people left behind. So
Yeah.
you know if he knew that there were mechanisms there, he probably would have also brought an engineer. So it just depends on what you know beforehand about what you're getting into. So for example, when I started my project at my tomb, I didn't know that there were human remains in there, because all the published information that I had excuse me, previously indicated that there was one room.
Okay.
There were actually two decorated rooms and a big long tunnel that led to a burial shaft that was full of human remains. So in the first few years, I didn't touch any of that human remains. I was just documenting the walls and preparing a research design to excavate what turned out to be hundreds of looted burials.
Okay.
So not a single intact burial, but until I could actually look down and walk into this area, I didn't know what was there. So in a few seasons after I started, that's when I assembled the team of anthropologists to look at the human remains. So
Okay. The second one that I have, and then we'll get into the rapid fire questions. Jumping all the way to the last movie, to one of the final scenes, it just stuck with me, because throughout this visit you've mentioned that archaeologists become part of the archaeological record.
mhm.
Does taking the fantastical premise that yes, he time traveled back to the time of Archimedes, taking that into account, that's very fantastical, would a real archaeologist kind of react the way he did, where he wanted to stay? Would a real
100%.
archaeologist have done that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean,
Even even though I guess the story would not have been told had they had the archaeologist stayed, the decision would be the same.
you know, because time travel is such a, you know, difficult thing to get our heads around, and since personally I don't know what mechanisms are involved, and
Hmm.
how it happens, or what the impact would be. A lot of science fiction speculates that history is always going to eliminate factors that change its ultimate course, as if it's already a completed
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
And our experience of it is moving through a thing that's already completed, in a sense. So, the idea of time and time travel is all kind of, um, you know, difficult to understand. But I think that the interest that we all have as professionals in the past is so great that we'd be willing to risk a lot in order to personally experience it, to
okay,
answer the questions that we have, to live among the people that we've studied, not just to see if we're right, but because we actually love the cultures that we study, that we become very invested emotionally in them.
yeah,
So you'll find that people in various fields, if someone says something negative about the group that they study, they will defend it
yeah,
as if it's their people, kind of. Um, so absolutely, it would be a hard decision to not stay.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I remember watching that last scene. I remember thinking, I want to ask if this is something that would actually happen.
Yeah.
And so I'm thank you for sharing that. That's a very interesting perspective on it. So as I said, I like to ask rapid questions, and these are ones I have 5 written down. These are ones that you can answer and provide a more description or a response, or you don't have to respond or I'm sorry, you don't have to give a description. Um, the first one is, do you have a favorite Indiana Jones movie? What is it?
First one,
Yeah. Okay.
the search for the Ark of the Covenant,
Okay.
because it's in Egypt.
Okay. Do you have a favorite within all movies?
Hmm.
Do you have a favorite Indiana Jones moment?
Um, Favorite moment. I think the moment that I quote the most is snakes. Why does it have to be snakes?
Yeah. Well, and when you were talking about entering a cave earlier, it made me think, um, would it be more accurate if Indiana Jones, he doesn't like snakes, he doesn't like spiders? Bats should probably have been added to that list as well, but it never comes up. It doesn't seem like that ever comes up. So, all right, the third one. Um, this can be Indiana Jones, it can be non-Indiana Jones movies. Do you have a favorite movie that is based on or deals with archaeology in some way?
Stargate.
Stargate. Okay.
I love
Um,
Stargate.
and is that my next question was the most accurate representation of archaeology in any movie or project?
Um, that's harder. I mean, there was a movie recently called The Dig, about the big Viking ship burial in England. I think it was it was criticized for being a little inaccurate in terms of like how it actually went down, but some of the negative things about it are actually pretty accurate. The erasure of women's participation in archaeology, even from the earliest days, because there were women, whether they were wives of the archaeologists or dilettantes who could, afford to summer, someplace fantastic and get involved in local culture things. Um, Women have always been present, but most archaeological most archaeology movies have male heroines and
Hmm.
men doing things and women in sort of invisible auxiliary positions. And that was not the case exactly. So the dig um, sort of captured that without meaning to specifically highlight that, because
Okay.
they sort of erased the participation of some of the women who were involved in that dig
Okay.
project. But also, it was accurate in the sense of it was a recent find. People are still living who were involved in it and could tell the story in their own voice. Um, so I thought it was an interesting way of looking at a historical archaeological project.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And the last one is if a studio ever came to you and said, we want to make a movie, an archaeologically based movie about
Mhm.
some time period or about some particular incident, and they asked you what your opinion would be for, doesn't have to have mass appeal, but if it appeals to you, what archaeology based movie would you like to see be made?
Well, there was talk several years ago of Will Smith doing a movie based on the pharaoh Taharko, who was a Nubian king in the 25th dynasty who ruled Egypt and Sudan. The 25th dynasty were rulers from further south outside of Egypt proper, but became Egyptian pharaohs. He's mentioned in the Old Testament as a prince who is sent to fight the Assyrians and aid the Hebrew
Mm-hmm.
kingdoms. Um, his life is fascinating because we have not just the Egyptian viewpoint, but the Near Eastern viewpoint. One of his children is taken off into captivity by the Assyrians when they sacked Memphis, the capital
Mm-hmm.
where he was ruling from. So I think his reign and everything about his life would be a super interesting movie. Um, but there's so many different kinds of movies that would be just just amazing and not based on anything that has any widespread notoriety or anything,
Mm-hmm.
but just you know there's little stories in ancient Egyptian that we have, like the shipwrecked sailor, about an Egyptian who's blown off course and ends up on an island with a giant talking snake. And they have this discussion about fate and family and home. And the snake had been exiled to the island and was lonely. And so there's a lot of really interesting viewpoints from ancient Egypt that could be made into movies with
Mm-hmm.
fantastical elements in them that would be, appealing in a movie sense, but also touch on the humanity of characters, because when we see a movie, some people just want to see stuff blow up,
Yeah.
but mostly people also want a story that connects them with a character and you recognize the character's feelings and emotional responses. And I think Shipwrecked Sailor would be a really uh, great movie. That there's some pieces missing from the story, so there would be a lot of you know literary license, which is
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for doing this. And before we go, I just wanted to ask, was there anything else that maybe I missed, or that you thought needed more attention that we didn't get to talk much about? Is there anything else you want people to know about this?
Yeah, I mean, the Indiana Jones movies are set in the past and portray some of the negative aspects of the history of archaeology and how we used to do things in the past, but that is not how things happen today. And so when people see those movies, they assume, perhaps wrongly, or definitely wrongly, that archaeology still looks like that.
Mm-hmm.
And to be sure, there's a moment right now where decolonizing archaeology is a major uh, concern, endeavor, interest, whatever you want to say, we still have some things that we need to fix in our discipline to make it to have more diverse voices represented, and to be more respectful of indigenous cultures who still have a claim to the things that we study, and to let indigenous people tell their history instead of us telling them what their history is, which is ultimately what Indiana Jones was kind of doing, was working in these exotic places like I do, and then presenting an analysis packaged back for anyone.
Mhm.
But there's a big difference between the way that it was done in the past and today, and a lot more awareness and sort of self-reflection on the part of archaeologists, who, by the way, are largely women. This is a field that is largely, statistically women and not men anymore. So, having those stereotypical archaeology heroes as men with, guns and bullwhips and
Yeah.
all the action adventure sort of trappings doesn't reflect the field at all. It's a lot of careful research, a lot of careful, painstaking attention to detail, and not a lot of stumbling around pushing over shelves full of priceless antiquities in a storeroom.
Yeah.
There's not a lot.
Yeah, that's a big, I would imagine that's a big no-no for
Yeah.
working
I mean, if I was trying to
archaeologists.
save my life, I would weigh it very carefully still, but you know.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Onstein, thank you so much for joining us. Is there, for anybody who wants to ask follow-up questions or anything, or have follow-up conversation, what's the best way for someone to get in touch with you?
Well, the university, maintains websites for all the departments. So if you go to the history department, so memphis.edu/history, you can find a tab for faculty and look for my name, Suzanne Onstine with an O, and my email, sonstine@memphis.edu, will be right there. Or you can take classes from me, because I teach ancient Egypt, I teach world history. Um, you know, you can join my class and learn all about it from me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this. And this was a lot of fun. Um, Thanks for walking us through the accuracies and inaccuracies of Indiana Jones. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for the chance. Yeah, you too. Take care.
Bye.